All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, February 28th combined work group meeting. First up, we have, I don't know who this person is, DGN.
Oh, that's me.
All right, there you go.
Yes, I wanted to present this last week already. I'll quickly share my screen if you don't mind.
Please do.
But I had to leave a bit early, so I didn't make it. Let's see. Okay, can you see that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Yeah, I had suggested this a few weeks ago. I think it's now 3 or 4 weeks ago that I brought this topic up. So this is about standardizing our Helm chart values, so the fields that we have in the values YAML for our Helm charts. And it came up mostly because we at Red Hat were working on this new operator that's going to be installing basically upstream Istio. So if you don't know, if you missed that, we have just created a repository in the Istio ecosystem organization, and we're moving our code base over there right now. And part of our effort is another, well, not quite a new API, but we obviously have a CRD that is used to install Istio, and the fields in the CRD, we have a process to automatically copy them from the values API that Istio uses. So Istio already has a proto file where we have the set of values that we support in the charts, and we use that for validation of the Istio operator resource. And the resource that we use in this new operator, the sale operator, will be very similar. So we will also be using the Helm chart values as the basis of our API. And while importing all the values and assigning types to them and so on, we noticed that there's a lot of differences. And you could say it's a bit chaotic, and that's just natural because the charts have grown over time, and we have charts from various time frames. We have relatively new charts like the Z-tunnel chart, and there's a new gateway chart, I think is the right one. Yeah, and then the older charts that have, like, especially the Istio D chart has organically grown over the years and has a lot of fields. And we wanted to start a discussion on yeah, big mess you could call it. We wanted to start the discussion on what do we from in an ideal world, what do we want the charts to look like? What sort of least common denominator do we want to have across them? The thing that we started out with was Kubernetes related fields, because that is one part where it gets really confusing. So some charts have a lot of Kubernetes related fields, right? You can, in the Istio D chart, you can configure auto scaling, you can configure how many replicas your deployment has, you can configure the environment variables on your Istio D pod and so on. And then in other charts, you don't. And some of the fields we even marked as deprecated in the protobuf file, because at some point when the Istio operator, so that was coming out of the Istio community, the operator was created, there was this idea that all the Kubernetes related fields would be done through this overlay mechanism. And that's long past, and we're not going to do that anymore. And now the consensus seems to be that we want to support a minimal set of fields, and everything else that you need, you should use customize to add, which I think is a very sane approach. But we're still stuck with all these fields, right? And we need to think about which ones do we want to keep, because some just make sense inherently, I think, and which ones we want to maybe deprecate and move away from in the future. So the very simple, so this document doesn't really that this document describes what I just said, and it tries to collect sort of a baseline set of values, so they're called the base values here, that we might want in every chart. And there's another section where, so the base values are identified here, and they're probably not complete, but that's something that I found across all the charts and I think makes sense, is image related fields. So selecting hub and tag and the image name and the variant, and image pull policy and image pull secrets. That's something that you basically need in every chart. Except in the gateway, because it's for injection. And there you just set image to auto, so you don't need all of these fields. And then the next field, the next part is already where we need to have a discussion. So what do we want to have as the standard Kubernetes fields? I know that from talking to John that when the Z tunnel chart was created, that people looked at other projects and what they had in their charts and what sort of the standard is for Helm charts to have. And it seemed to be something like this. So you have labels, which is applied to all top level resources. You have annotations that are applied to all top level resources. And then you have more specific things like pod labels and pod annotations. That I don't even know if that's very common. It's something that's very common in our charts though. And yeah, we use it, for example, for the Prometheus configuration. And then things like volumes and volume mounts. And resources is something that comes up all the time. Yes, Costin?
So I know there is a Helm init or template or whatever that you do to, if you want to start from scratch. How different is it from what you have?
When you create a new
boilerplate. Yeah, when you use a boilerplate, Helm create or whatever, there is. I know in IntelliJ and other places there is a command to create a Helm chart from scratch. If you don't know anything about the Helm, you do new Helm chart and it auto fills with some boilerplate.
I would actually have to try that. I haven't tried it. I know that these would probably be in there, and these would be in there, the volume.
Yeah, the structure. I'm talking about the structure. How's there? I mean, image, for example, is in a particular way. My goal is to have complete alignment with all the other Helm charts outside of Istio. I think John also did this for Z-tunnel, started from the scratch template.
Mm-hmm.
Because most people, when they start, they use that and they get a structure that is probably common.
Yeah, that's something that I can look at. Yeah, that's a good point. I can use the Helm init to create a new chart and see what it outputs. I mean, there's some things like hub and tag which have sort of become standard in Istio. So I don't know so there. I think the decision will be hard between what our users are used to and what the Helm defaults are. But yeah, I can take a look what it looks like when you create a fresh Helm chart. Yeah, so these are sort of the Kubernetes settings that are present in a lot of Helm charts. And added some here like env for environment variables for the pods, which is not always there, but you can see it in a lot of charts actually. And then something we also have, and it's probably useful, the pod disruption budget, but I'm not so sure about being able to configure it. So maybe it makes sense to have an enablement Boolean, but because the pod disruption budget is immutable, I don't know how much sense it makes to have like configuration fields, because it's just bound to create issues when you install the charts multiple times. So these are sort of scheduler related settings that we would probably want there. Yes, Benjamin?
Yeah, I was going to say that I don't think most of these are terribly controversial. I would rather err on the side of having common values that most charts expose as overridable for us too. If that the way to handle that is to document the values using automation, right? So that we actually like use a documentation generator to run on our values files that will spit out a markdown file that says, here are all the values, here are how you set them. If you set this and this, you might have a problem because of X, right? We can do all that. That's what everybody else does. We should do that. But I think a lot of the disputes around, you know, like disruption budget or whatever, I want the automation of how we cache this stuff in CI and enforce this across CI, across all charts, is like, that's where the proof is. If we can do that, I think it'll sort of fall out of that, like what makes sense to globally require and what does not. Because I know for like Z-tunnel, pod disruption budget might be a little tricky to let people customize, but I don't know if that means we shouldn't do it. But I think actually automating this for all our charts will make it pretty clear pretty quickly what is the common set of things that everybody should have. And so that's like what I care about, is like the actual CI automation. Let's do that. And from that sort of derive what everybody should have these in their charts values are.
Right. So that's the next part. That's sort of the, so I covered that a little bit here, or let's say in this paragraph about treating Helm values as an API. So the development and CI, the whole process around how we manage this API, and basically first treating it as an API, and then, you know, making sure we also protect it the same way we protect the rest of our API. I think that's important. So this is sort of the process part of this document, right? Where I think too that we should have automation around it to sort of stop the wild growth of Helm fields. But I also think that for that to work, we also need some guidelines on what we even want, because just having automation doesn't really stop anything from being added. You know, if people still approve the PRs, then things will still get in. But at least we'll have more discussion. Like today, it's fairly easy to get a new field into a chart and, you know, expose it, and then it's just there because we can't really remove it because people rely on it.
I think limiting what people add is sort of a separate thing. This is to me more about enforcing what every chart must have, right? And then other charts may have more than this, and that's a separate discussion of, does this chart need this to be a value or whatever. Like, I think splitting those concerns probably makes this a little easier. And one other question, I'm sorry, real quick, and then Costin. Do you know if there is a tool to actually generate all possible values by rendering the actual chart? Or are all the linting tools out there just going off of your values YAML as the authoritative source? Because I'm wondering if there's a way to like actually render the chart and say, the chart on the disk has these possible values, and then compare that to your actual checked in values YAML and make sure they match. But that may not exist. It may just be that the possible values for Helm charts, all those tools that handle that, are just looking at your values.yaml as opposed to actually rendering and templating the chart to discover the possible values. I don't know.
I think everything's pretty much looking at values.yaml that I know. Looking at the charts, it's not necessarily like you can do all sorts of crazy things. I mean, just look at the stuff we do with profiles, right? You can modify the values at runtime and do all sorts of wonky things. So it's kind of problematic. There are definitely tools that look at the values. We even used to have one that we made ourselves. We should not make our own. I'm sure there's plenty out there that are fine. I personally don't mind just looking at the YAML file directly. It's on our, displayed in various places. But I understand having it in Markdown would be nice as well. So
yeah.
Yeah, but we do need something that works two ways, right? Because we also need to make sure that things actually show up in values that are used in the charts, so we can make sure that they're documented. Because otherwise, you could add something to the chart, and it never shows up in values, and nobody's. Yeah, you could sneak 100%. In, maybe even accidentally, a field, and then it's not documented and nobody knows about it.
Yeah, that's the thing I think we can't cache with tooling right now.
So to kind of avoid some confusion here, it's not necessarily wrong that you have some things in the charts that you don't have in values, because another goal was to keep values.yaml clean and to have only the things that most people actually need, and because it's kind of an API. but there are all kind of things that some vendors, very specific corner case that only one person, or some super corner case where you need to customize it, but you don't want to expose it as an API and to be committed to it forever. So there is a trade-off, and there is, I think, a legitimate use case to have some values, some settings that are not exposed. And what I was trying to point out, we had last week a discussion about having, the experimental channel versus a stable channel for APIs. And if we treat values.yaml as APIs, that makes a lot of sense. Either we have two values.yaml, one with a stable channel with pretty much V1 stuff that we are 100% committed to, and we have a separate one for experimental stuff, or we have one API and then we allow experiments to be not in values.yaml proto, but hidden is a template, or some other combination. But there is a need for both. That's for sure. And my last point is, if we go the CRT route and having a clear API for the Istio side of the settings, not necessarily Kubernetes, I keep saying most things are real CRD with real runtime behavior. Very few. I mean, even the environment variables, yes, you need to restart Istio, but it is very easy to change the semantics of those settings to be dynamically loaded. So there is no such thing as an install time Istio config. There is an Istio set of configurations that we happen to force it to reinstallation, to Helm upgrade. But my ideal scenario will be that there will be no Istio specific thing in the values.yaml, only Kubernetes thing, and everything related to Istio will be in this CRD, CRD you define presumably, but also read by Istio itself. So you don't have to reinstall Istio to use your. I mean, I understand your operator is great, it's wonderful, but if we put an API that control Istio, it shouldn't be your operator reading the CRD, creating some other weird stuff, pass it to Istio, restart Istio. It should be Istio watching that CRD as well, and some of them may require to restart and can kill itself, or that, I'm not saying we don't need to restart it, but we should move into this direction at least.
I fully agree. It's just that some features will always need install time config, right? There's some things you just need to do at install time, or where you need to create something in the cluster for it to work.
Minimum stuff, yes. I mean, I'm not saying it's. I mean, there are exceptions. I'm sure there will be cases where we need to restart Istio, but the ideal should not be to restart Istio, because you may have multi-tenant Istio, you have all kind of other combinations that don't require, and it's painful to restart.
Yeah, so John just said in the chat that the exceptions pile up quickly, and it's true. I also looked at it. You can find a bunch of cases where it would be easy to move things into runtime config, so mesh config, for example, because they have things are configured in Helm, but they actually have no interface with installation. They don't need anything in the cluster. So there's a few fields that we could move like that. And all the environment variables that configure like experimental behavior obviously are like that, or most of them at least. But still, there are some that, so let's say, I think there's this analysis flag where you can enable the Istio analysis controller, and it needs special permissions on objects to write to status and so on. And that is only created if you set this flag in the Helm chart. And then you get into the situation where, yes, you could move this into runtime config and basically and always create those permissions. But is that better? I don't know. So yeah, I guess we would have to look at, yeah, so maybe this is a much bigger task, and we would have to actually look at all the fields we have and see exactly what their install time needs are, and or whether they could be moved to runtime, and then from that see what we could change. So that's why this document is really more about this set of base things that we need anyway in every chart, and it's not trying to analyze all the fields. I guess we should do that as well. but it's a much bigger task. And I think something we could get started with would be to define the set of base values that we want, create the automation to protect these base values, make sure they are there, and then we could have additional automation that makes sure that, you know, fields are documented and potentially even fields that are used in the charts show up in values, because it's another thing we don't have. And then from there we could go and, you know, have this big review of all the Helm values. But that's a much bigger task than this.
That makes sense to me. I would say, though, that I kind of disagree with what Costin said earlier, that about charts that exist, or charts that have values that are not mentioned in values YAML. I think that's just undocumented flags and is bad, and we should have none of those. If it's something you can override in values, it should be documented in values. And if it is something we don't want people to use, it shouldn't be overrideable, and you can just customize or fork the charts, right? But I would, anytime we have something like that in the code, I would say that's a smell. And I would prefer not to have that, right? It either needs to be, if it's overrideable, it needs to be documented. And if it's not documented, it shouldn't be overrideable. And if we have an exception to that, I'd be really curious to know what they are. But anyway, that's it.
Dawn, you had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I was just gonna say overall my thoughts on this. I think all the stuff about adding better testing and documentation to of the current state, that sounds good. Doesn't seem terribly controversial. I agree we can and probably should look at improving the current state of the API. I don't want to say like everything should move out of values.yaml or something prescriptive like that. Like we'll need to do it on a case-by-case basis, but I think that's something we can tackle on a case-by-case basis. So.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what I mean by sort of this big review. I think it's going to take a lot of time actually looking at all the individual fields and making sense of them and seeing why they are there and, you know, whether they need to be in the Helm charts. Yeah, and as you mentioned, if you look at a few of them, you can actually quickly find some that do need to be in the Helm charts because they just do things that you can only do at install time or as a cluster operator, and you can't do from within Istio easily. So yeah, we should definitely do that, but that it wasn't what I was proposing here, and we can have that as a follow-up. The others, and that's actually, I even mentioned that here. So the whole feature enablement even specifically said outlook on a further RFC because it is a much bigger task to look at how do we want to do beta or stable features, and that's exactly what we just discussed. You know, can we move them to mesh config? Do they have to stay in Helm? Do they have to be in both? And then also experimental features. Do we want to keep them the way they are as environment variables? I actually think that it's good to have an easy way to add experimental features without too much API discussion in the beginning, as long as they are clearly, as long as users can clearly see that they're experimental features and, you know, not accidentally activate them and expect them to be stable, because that allows us to have sort of quick turnarounds and iterations on new features without, you know, the long discussions around how the API should look and so on. That can happen in parallel while the feature is maturing. So I think we should still have that. Maybe it doesn't have to be environment variables, but yeah, that's something we can discuss. So that's I think it warrants another RFC, and it will need this closer look at all the fields we have and what they do to see what we could actually do there.
I mean, when did it happen? When we had an experimental feature that we, you know, sneak it in without any review because it's experimental, and then it didn't become an API.
It didn't become an API in the sense of.
In the sense it is an API from a user perspective, and we cannot change it afterwards. I mean, look at the DNS capture, look at the telemetry APIs, look at everything that all the experiment we did. difference between either we were perfect from the beginning, or something is wrong, because there is almost no difference between the final version and what we treat as V1 or beta and what we experiment. Anyway, that's a different story.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, but I think it's the problem there is rather that people then maybe are not putting in the effort to progress the feature through the stages, right? I mean, those things become relied upon by users because they're fairly stable, but we never put in the work to declare them officially stable. So I guess that's why that happens. And of course, I mean, if you make it easy to add experimental features but hard to have stable features, then that can always happen. I agree, but well, that's I guess that's the cost of it, and we just have to get better at progressing features through the stages. Okay, well, thanks for the discussion anyway. I will work on this a little bit more and maybe come back if I have some meaningful updates. I don't want to take up the whole call, so I'll stop presenting. Thank you very much, and yeah, I'll come back if I have news on this.
All right. Next up, we have Satish. Is Satish on the call?
Yeah, it's ours. Like I'm Kantosh. So, shall I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me know once you are able to see. So we have a requirement. So in our large scale deployments, so we have a lot of clusters and have different envoy filters to be applied for the timeouts. Basically at HTTP and TCP and stream level timeouts, right? So what we are proposing are like we require some kind of inputs. So where can we push these particular timeouts into Istio resources? So I mean, we started with the proposal for these to be like, let's say, so example, we have currently we have the envoy filter. So these envoy filter, let's say, for the ideal timeout for the HTTP protocol options and the max time duration. So if we want these to be applied at Istio level, so we thought of using virtual service. I mean, we need to have an agreement like whether we can go ahead with extend the virtual service to use these particular timeouts to be applied at Istio resource level. So this is our kind of requirement. So there are many such timeouts on the envoy filter, which we wanted, which is currently not available at the Istio level to be configured. So that's what our approach to start with timeouts which are not present at Istio level to be having. So we need some kind of comments or suggestions on these. So like I saw Kat as commented out, and he was asking some questions. So we kind of clarified. But what I understood from the Rama and the Hozang is something that it is not possible to move these to be moved at Istio level because of the complexity. So need some more suggestions or comments on this particular thing. Anyone, please?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate a lot with Keith's comment, which is just out of view. You know, yeah, I get it. That there's potential use cases, but do we need all of these in the API? Do we need to push this complexity to all of our users? It feels very niche a bit.
Um, I didn't get you.
I'm worried about exposing like 10 different fields to users that are all various timeouts, and how we explain this to users and how we rationalize these in the API and make sense of it and maintain it and test it and support it and make things clear to users.
Yeah, basically we don't support every single Envoy configuration in our Istio API, right? And the reason we support a good set of them is based on a lot of users asking. So for your particular scenario to configure the timeout parameters in the connection manager, I think it's worth for you to maybe do a little bit more research. Is this a common request by many users before the Istio project can consider adding something like this?
Okay. So we'll check. I mean, is there any open source issues are there along in the similar lines, and then we'll link together. But I tried checking, but I couldn't find out many, because of which I created a new one. Yeah, got your point. So basically, based on the more requests, so we are going to add. Is it something or?
Yeah, essentially, the Istio project has been perceived as complex, so we are cautious on adding new functions or new configuration knobs to make it more complex, unless a lot of user needs it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Sure. Thanks.
Will it be reviewed based on the case as well, like the use case that we define? Is that if that is strong enough, can we pursue that?
I mean, if that user case resonate with a lot of people, potentially, but right now I'm not sure if it resonates with a lot of people.
Okay. Is it only considered if many people request it, or like if the case is strong enough to get into that? Is that good enough?
Yeah, I think that would certainly help with our decision. So that's one requirement. The other requirement is, what other risks are you introduced, and who's going to be willing to do the work, or what are the tests associated with that, right? But the first requirement is this a common request by many users?
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think we'll come back with more queries.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this up.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for your service.
All right. So, Whitney, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay, so continuing the release channel discussion, I wanted to share some of the updates that we had in the doc, as well as drive some decision around a couple of points. So since you all may have reviewed the doc, there have been some updates like these definitions on the picture. For instance, like what we shared last time, this is sort of like what our experimental channel and standard channel will look like. The experimental channel is the superset, and that will contain both API versions that are like alpha and GA, as well as API fields that are experimental and standard. Whereas the standard channel is a subset of that, even though it contains both API versions, alpha and GA. The only API fields that are included are those that are standard. So this is how we are currently designing this. And Mitch brought up a great point last time where we sort of discussed how we are extending the understanding of like API versions, where now we have like a version of V1 Alpha 1 in experimental that is not the same as the version in standard. So I've added this section where for the most part, like you expect an API version to be the only reference to inform like the expected features and behavior of the iteration of the API. And that is how it behaves for the V1 API versions in all release channels. However, when we get to the experimental side of things, this was the best way we can see to aid in not breaking users when they're switching between channels and upgrading Istio is by ensuring that the standard channel is also aware of this V1 Alpha 1 API version, but what is actually dictating the expected behavior and features in that alpha version is the channel it's in. So this is something that we'll have to actively educate users on, and we expect to really flesh out the documentation and hopefully even some analyzer alerts that will hopefully inform a user that, hey, they're attempting to use like an experimental channel, V1 Alpha 1 API version in the standard channel. We also thought of maybe even adding like annotations to the CRD that denotes which Istio version this this version of the CRD works best with. So I think Mitch, you're the one who had the most concerns here, but please give this a review and let me know if this is enough to like introduce V1 Alpha in this way.
Yeah, no, I think it took a while of just considering, but I do think this makes sense. I like that the API version names are different from the channel names so that there's not overlap or confusion there. And given that there are other projects like the Gateway project moving in a very similar direction, I think this looks good.
Okay, perfect. And then ideally what we want is to get to a world where the only API versions we have is that V1 Alpha 1 and V1. So right now we have like V1 Alpha X and V1 Beta 1 and so on. Ideally, those will eventually go away. And how it does so, we will decide further on. But I just wanted to know that versions will be simplified down to V1 Alpha 1, V1, and then the channel, standard channel, experimental channel. So hopefully that gets us over the hump of having a lot of API versions that we have to maintain. Okay, so with that said, we have updated sort of like the attributes of each channel. So like you can, not much has changed per se, but we did expand on what happens with like backward compatible changes, and then how new fields will be added, especially if those fields are experimental, they will be annotated. And we re-emphasize that the standard channel does not have experimental features. In the experimental channel, we sort of listed out like the break-in changes that are acceptable. So the caveat here is yes, the experimental channel is experimental, so there are break-in changes that are allowed, but it must not impact the features that have already been promoted to standard. But once it's not a change to a standard field, these are the break-in changes that will be allowed, such as like deprecating experimental fields, changing the data type of an experimental field, and so on. And one thing that we have been going back and forth on is that where these break-in changes should occur, like should we create a V1 Alpha 1 plus N API version? But this will introduce, once again, the perpetual management of like multiple API versions. So we are really going to rely on evangelizing the user to understand that a certain alpha version is specific to the channel as well as the release of Istio. So these break-in changes will be introduced into the V1 Alpha 1 API. And we have to be very explicit with like our messaging to users for the experimental channel. because this is definitely for those who are like way more savvy. They understand that they will have to make changes upon every upgrade because break-in changes are allowed. So we added some more intentionality around that. And then heading into the legacy channel, this is one of those areas that we have to come to a decision on still, where from the last calls and the discussions that we had, we foresee this legacy channel being on par with the experimental channel, but more so as like a frozen snapshot of what Istio APIs look like today without the concept of channels. And we introduced this as an as aid to help with the transition, in the sense that as we are helping users on ramp on the release channel model, they can continue to use what they're used to using by just using the legacy channel, and then eventually intentionally move over to the standard channel or experimental channel based on their appetite. So we foresee that this channel will exist ideally beyond 4 releases after the experimental channel is fully functional, before we remove it and transparently force users to move to one of the channels, whether it's standard or experimental. And then as we're releasing the standard channel and the experimental channel, we are intending to make changes to the APIs that may graduate certain features or APIs accordingly. Those changes will not be reflected in the legacy channel, as, like I said, this is just a snapshot of what Istio APIs look like today. So that's something to consider. And then I also want to start highlighting the requirements that will be needed, where we can say, okay, we are comfortable with removing the legacy channel. So I started this list. If you all have any thoughts, feel free to add here. I think, Benjamin, you had a good bit of opinion around this, which I appreciated. And then I added this table, which is sort of like a reflection of like all the APIs in Istio and whether that will exist in the standard channel or experimental channel. So as you can see, the standard channel is all of our needed Istio networking APIs. The only APIs that wouldn't be there is our clearly alpha APIs, which are Envoy Filter and WASM plugin. And along with this proposal, we are introducing a subset of telemetry API fields as well to the standard channel. Okay, so any questions so far? Great. Okay, so going to this section, we are trying to like enumerate like the different scenarios we have to keep aware of in terms of how this can bite us and come up with plans. So it's still a work in progress, but if you can think of any additional scenarios, feel free to add here, and then go into what we discussed last time was the changes we need to do for getting like our Istio networking policies into the standard. So as we're aware, all of these policies are of V1 beta 1 type right now. And we have been going back and forth in terms of like, are we going to introduce these policies as a V1 beta type into the standard channel as the exception until we can actually graduate those to V1? And I believe the consensus is that some of those V1 beta types have additional alpha X versions attached. I feel like it's safe for us to say that we can deprecate those alpha X versions. So for instance, there's like a V1 alpha 2 version and so forth. But based on the fact that there's a V1 beta 1 version of that resource, I believe that without much effort, we should be able to deprecate the alpha X version. And with that, we are proposing adding the V1 beta 1 resource to the standard channel, creating a V1 version of that resource in the standard channel, and eventually transitioning away from the V1 beta 1 resource. The effort required to create this V1 version, I'm hoping can be a matter of like, let's decide that, hey, because I feel like there's 2 pathways we can take where we go analyze each one of these beta resources and decide what it means in the Istio world now, and do a similar effort that we are doing with telemetry API, or we can simply accept that the beta is as stable as we want it to be, and do more of like a renaming function. So yes, Lynn?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I assume there's no impact to existing user with your approach, if I'm reading correctly, and it's up to their choice to transition away from V1 Beta 1 when they want to, but not being forced, at least for the foreseeable months that I can
Yeah.
see.
So there's no impact in deprecating Alpha X, I can say. In terms of the beta, I think at some point we want to force them to transition to the V1 resource, but that can be done delicately. But
Okay,
we are
my
keeping
other
in mind the impact. Yes.
Okay, sounds good. My other question is, you mentioned about create a V1 version of the resources in the standard channel. What about the resources that has a equivalent replacement in the gateway API and potentially Gamma? Are we going to hold off promoting those from V1 Beta 1 to
To
V1?
V1. Yeah, I think this is where that effort comes in terms of like evaluating each one of those resources to see what we really want out of them. I don't have an answer right away. Go ahead, Keith.
You can finish. I just had some thoughts on Lynn's question.
Yeah, I don't have an answer off the bat of my head, but I feel like those resources, what we want to get the APIs to be is really of like a V1 uniformity. And for the Istio APIs, that ideally isn't going to go away unless we force users to go away, but there is a replacement. I get the sense that we want to still keep those around. And if we have to keep them around, I believe we should put effort into making them V1 version, even if it's just a matter of saying that, okay, we're accepting that the V1 version of this is just the beta version, just renamed. Yeah. Yes, go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I think this is a good topic, somewhat tangential, but I think it's important to get an answer from maybe some of our TOC representatives on the call. We've talked about this from time to time about things like Gateway API kind of becoming the resource for Istio for certain types of things, and what that means for our for the Istio specific resources. I'm going to make a statement then an opinion. I think that, well, that's the question then an opinion. I want to ask, and I want to ask the community and TOC specifically, do we see API versioning being coupled to recommendations? Because if we look at Kubernetes, we actually see those things being decoupled. Speaking of Gateway API, this is a good example of this is the Ingress space. So the Ingress API is a V1 resource, but it's marked as frozen. No new efforts being done towards it. It's not going to change. Therefore, its version is V1, but it's not being invested in, and it's effectively deprecated, but just not going to be removed. I think it might be useful in navigating some of these conversations and as it relates to release channels and coming up with some decisions here. It might be useful to understand, just because something hits API stability of V1, does that mean that we can't come back later and add an OpenTelemetry API or have HTTP route become a thing that we recommend for most users? My personal opinion is no. I think API versioning is distinct from what we as a community recommend users to use, or where we put effort from a project resourcing perspective. But others may disagree. There may be some historical context that I'm missing, but I think that's kind of unknown that I haven't maybe heard put out concretely. So I would appreciate some opinions here.
Yeah, my past opinion was that we should not promote things to V1 because they were going to be replaced by the Gateway API. I think in hindsight, that might have been the wrong decision, and it may make sense to actually go and promote the networking APIs to V1 for the reasons you said. I don't have a very strong opinion, but I would be in favor of that if others wanted to push in that direction as well. Because it is confusing, right? Like, we're not going to go remove virtual service and make breaking change to it. So why keep it at beta, especially if we're going and promoting other APIs like authorization policy and whatnot.
So if we do promote those to version 1, does that takes away from the capability for us to transition away from those API? Like the bullet you have from the 3 to 4, right? The fact that we have beta, we can potentially transition away. And the fact that we have claim it as V1, I guess we can still deprecate, we'll just continue to support it. Is that how Kubernetes works?
I mean, you can still deprecate something that's V1. We'll just have to have an extremely long window before removal, like years. Although actually Kubernetes might say that they'll never do it. I forget what I don't think we say that though. It says that within 1 year of advance notice, it could be removed. Now, would we really do that? I'd highly doubt it. I think if we were to say we're going to remove virtual service, we would. I don't even know what that would look like. It would probably be like a Istio V2 scenario, or many years, I would guess. I think it's, a slow death is probably a more likely scenario. Like, who here has heard of replication controller in Kubernetes? It's very obscure, but it's a V1 API, so it's still there. Literally no one uses it. But.
Yeah, I do think that's probably virtual service going to end up with. It will be there if you want to use it or if you still have it, but down the road, when the gateway API is mature and equivalent, people probably not going to use it, the virtual service one.
One thing, and then I want to make sure Kostin gets a chance to go, but I don't even know that that's a realistic reality, to be completely honest with you. I personally don't think Gateway API replaces virtual service completely, because Gateway API is a specification that is agnostic of data plane implementation. Virtual service, we can do a lot more virtual service. In one of the earlier agenda topics I had to miss, unfortunately, was talking about, hey, Envoy's got these fields, can we put them in virtual service? And that's never going to be the case with Gateway API. We're not even going to be able to have a conversation with Gateway API because Nginx doesn't support all the different timeouts and things that Envoy does. And so I would throw some caution into statements like that, because I really think that Gateway API, like relying on Gateway API, means that we have to take the least common denominator for some things. And that might be detrimental to certain users and certain use cases who have traditionally used Istio and may want to use Istio. So I just think we have to be careful. Sorry, go ahead, Kostin.
Yeah, no, on what you were saying, I mean, we have vendor extension exactly for that in the Gateway API. Don't forget, the reason Gateway API exists is that both Ingress and virtual service made some fundamental mistakes in the design and a lot of other things, and we try to correct them by and realizing we cannot fix either Ingress or Istio because they're already too broadly used. The only solution was to create a new API. That's why we have Gateway API, not because we have disagree with the Nginx or other things. I used to be very strongly against promoting to V1. Now kind of changed my mind a bit. I kind of agree with John that we could promote to V1 is not going to change anything. I mean, the APIs, we have no way to change any of the experimental API, even the telemetry, all the discussions. You can just say everything is V1, but also make it clear that the APIs are flawed, users need to understand that what we have is not the right API for most cases, and Gateway does fix some fundamental issues, and it's a better, more secure API for anyone who cares about security. And in time, hopefully, will not deprecate, but it will just die natural death by people moving naturally to a better API. I don't know.
So what that sounds like, Austin, is what you're saying is your preferred, or what you'd be okay with is promote, document, deprecate.
Promote to V1 as a kind of, this is a V1, it's stable, we are not going to touch it, but we recommend you use the gateway API because of those flaws in the API. Be honest, hey, it exposes a lot of functionality, but that came at a cost that is your stability and security, basically.
If it has an equivalent, in the gateway API, to Keith's point, not every single knobs in virtual service can be translated.
No, everything can be translated with vendor APIs. The gateway API is not only about HTTP route, it's also about having, almost like we did it already for authorization. You just attach it to a route, and it has slightly different semantics and scalability and other characteristics, but you can still expose all the knobs. It's not, there is an Envoy controller for gateways that is exposing almost, or can expose all Envoy features.
But not for Istio OSS user, right? You're talking about user using extensions on top of gateway API, which I assume those extensions, it's not going to land in the open source. Is that correct?
No. Istio APIs are extension. Destination rule, pretty much everything you slap a target ref on top of it, and you can turn it into a vendor-specific extension. Even stuff from virtual service, it can be moved as a Istio-specific virtual. Kit did this for a lot of APIs already. It's not the process works for almost everything.
Okay, sounds like we have a good consensus there. Moving on to the next decision. It seems like most of us understand like the V1 alpha approach we are taking in the standard channel, but I did want to highlight the fact that it might be weird or not a natural approach. And if that's the case, like, are we okay with it, or do we want to still continue brainstorming alternatives? For instance, I know we chose to put the V1 Alpha 1 version in the standard channel as well, because that was the best way to reduce breakage when upgrading Istio and switching between release channels. But we can put that responsibility on the user, where they have to migrate their own custom resources before upgrading. And then also, go ahead, Benjamin.
I was just going to say, like, if I'm understanding this right, either way, we may or may not have V1 Alpha 1's versions in standard, but we will never add new V1 Alpha 1 versions into standard from that point on, right? So we could eventually, even if we put them in there, we will never add new ones to standard. So it could be a thing where we eventually starve out the ones that are left. And if we never put new V1 Alpha 1s into standard, I am indifferent as to whether we exclude them or keep them in standard for the time being, because I think we'll end up at the same place. So either is fine. I don't have a huge preference as long as we don't put them new V1 Alpha 1 APIs into standard after this point.
Okay. Anyone else has thoughts there?
He's dropped another meeting, but one thing, just to double click on Ben's point a bit, one thing that might be still disambiguating is putting V1 resources with V1 Alpha 1 stored versions in the standard channel, which is different from putting, for example, a rosin plugin or Envoy filter into the standard channel. That's another dimension of the decision matrix, I think, that should be kept in mind. So should we allow users to apply a V1 Alpha 1 resource if you're using the standard channel, or do they have to update all of their YAMLs to use the V1 version? Something to consider.
Cool. Okay. So
can we keep this open for a little bit longer? Because the ambient call is starting. I don't think we'll be able to approve this right in this meeting. I
Yes.
think I need to a little bit more time to think about it.
And you're speaking about this specific decision or the entire doc?
Yeah, the entire doc. Sorry, you might have
Okay.
presented before, but I missed the past few meetings.
No worries. Yes, so I can wrap up now, and thank you again, and feel free to, it's safe to go read the doc again. It tells the unified story. Talk to you all soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks everyone. Bye.